Hey everybody, I'm Jack Rita. I'm the designer of the ECAS and More Tiny expansion, which is the third expansion for the classic Dune board game, the 2019 edition from Gale Force 9. And one of the variants in that expansion is something called Homeworlds. And we're going to focus on a particular homeworld, and that is Kaitain, which is the homeworld for the Emperor. And the way the homeworlds work is you're going to have an accompanying homeworld card that has a high threshold value, and when the Emperor has enough reserves on that homeworld, they're going to have an extra advantage. When it dips down, though, you're going to flip the card over to its low threshold side, and there the Emperor is going to incur a disadvantage. There's also the ability to attack Kaitain and occupy it, and if that happens, the occupier gets an advantage as well. So let's cover all those things and talk about what they do. We're going to start with high threshold. So for the Emperor, it's having 5 to 20 of their forces on Kaitain. And so what happens is when they have at least 5 of their forces on Kaitain, at the end of bidding, the Emperor can pay 2 spice per card to discard treachery cards from their hand. And that's going to be a pretty big deal. The Emperor is one of the richest factions in the game. Consistently throughout the game, they can generally afford to buy 1 or more treachery cards. It's not unusual for the Emperor to have a full hand at the end of the bidding phase. But buying a lot of cards means you're increasing the chances you're going to get a worthless card. You may get a cheap hero when you don't really want one, or some other card that's not useful, maybe a duplicate of something that you already have. And so normally the only way to get rid of those cards that you don't want is to get into a battle, and you may not want to get into a battle just to get rid of an excess card or worthless card. So for the Emperor to be able to shed those cards immediately is going to help them out and let them pick their battles a little more frequently. So what happens when the Emperor dips down below 5 forces? So that means they're going to have over 15 of their forces off of Kaitain, hopefully on the map for Arrakis, but it also could be in the tanks. What happens, they're going to flip over, they're going to be at low threshold. And then what happens there, when the Emperor is at low threshold, they only collect half, rounded up, of treachery card payments. So somebody pays 5 spice for a card, the Emperor's only getting 3 of that spice, and the other 2 will go to the spice bank. So that's going to put a dent in the income for the Emperor. Now, smart Emperor, again, knowing that this is going to happen, you can be a little more conservative with your payments. You can keep your reserves for maybe a little bit longer. Maybe you're not going to put 15 forces into Habanya Siege on turn 1. You may be a little more strategic about how you reduce your forces on Kaitain until you are ready to go for the win. But you can also be stockpiling that spice, and having half of that income may not be as impactful. Oftentimes, too, later in the game, if factions, if there aren't a lot of economy factions in there, and you're not getting as much from the spice blows, cards don't generally sell for as much. So the margins are going to be smaller, but that's gonna change from game to game. So sometimes you'd be like, oh, I would have gotten 4 spice, now I'm only getting 2. It's only 2 less, so maybe that's not as big a deal. But sometimes the Emperor, he wants all of that spice. Now, if you attack Kaitain and you become the occupier, what do you get out of that? Well, first of all, you're going to get a 2 spice income in spice collection phase. That's from the spice bank. But furthermore, the occupier collects the other half, that is the rounded down half, of treachery card payments. So instead of that going to the spice bank, it's going to go to the occupier. So that is a real big incentive to go after Kaitain. Now remember, Kaitain has a +2 when they're having battles. That's going to be added to their dials when they're at high threshold. But Kaitain, when Kaitain is at low threshold, that bumps up to a 3. So they actually get a bigger home field advantage when they're fighting to regain the capital, as it were. So an interesting deviation there from a lot of the other homeworlds. In many cases, it's the same number. We saw from the Bene Gesserit that they get a higher bonus when they're at high threshold than they do at low threshold. So that is how that's going to work. Now, something we should point out, though, is that this 5 to 20 is really for basic. What happens in advanced? Well, in advanced, the Emperor has another planet. They have Salusa Secundus. And that is where they're going to put their Sardaukar. So in advanced, the Emperor has 2 homeworlds. They're going to put their 15 non-Sardaukar forces on Kaitain, and their other 5 forces are going to be on Salusa Secundus. And so right away with Kaitain, they're starting with a little bit closer to the low threshold. It's still pretty manageable, and they're going to get that bonus as well. But with Salusa Secundus and in advanced, you're going to have the 5 Sardaukar on there. So high threshold for Salusa is 2 to 5. So as long as they have at least 2 Sardaukar on this planet, they're going to get the following advantage. They do not need spice to be counted at full strength. So that's a big deal, because remember, the Sardaukar, they count as 2. Now, having to pay the spice, well, usually the Emperor can afford that anyway, but it is a nice little perk to be able to say, sure, we can count that as full strength. We can dial those 2s and not have to worry about the spice. So that can be a pretty big deal. They also have the +3 when they're for their home field advantage at high threshold. Now, when they dip down, when there's only 1 Sardaukar on Salusa, or there's none, they're going to be at low threshold. And what happens there is that the Sardaukar forces may not be revived for free. So the Emperor only has 1 free revival each turn. They can still pay to revive up to the limit, which is normally 3. They can only get 1 Sardaukar. They can only revive 1 Sardaukar, whether it's free or not. So they don't get the Sardaukar out for free. They'll have to pay to get those guys out. So it's not a real big impact there for the Emperor, but it is a nuisance. So that's the point of that. But it really, the ante gets upped if somebody is occupying Salusa Secundus, because what happens is the Sardaukar lose their Sardaukar advantage, so they no longer count as 2, and that affects every battle that the Sardaukar are in, not just battles with the occupier. So it's not that you can ignore the Sardaukar; it's just that the Sardaukar, their home world has been taken over. They're a little demoralized. And so, yeah, they're not fighting at the same strength. So the Emperor has to be keenly aware of the vulnerability, putting all 5 of the Sardaukar out there. It's going to be hard for them to maintain an unoccupied Salusa Secundus. Now, there's some interesting nuances with the Emperor in advance. When they're making a shipping action, they can ship forces from Kaitain and Salusa as part of the same shipment. So it's not like, oh, I have to decide from which planet the forces are going to come from. They can come from both as part of the same shipment. The other thing is in a movement action, the Emperor can move forces between these 2 planets rather than moves forces on Arrakis. So you can have some of your Emperor non-Sardaukar forces go over to Salusa to help to protect it. But what's interesting here is that this reserve is Sardaukar forces. So if you've got 0 Sardaukar here, but you've got 5 Emperor forces, you're still at low threshold. So you have to keep that in mind, is that while you can move the forces back and forth, that these don't, on Kaitain is a different story, because the Sardaukar are still Emperor forces, but the non-Sardaukar are not Sardaukar. So you have to keep that in mind. You can move the forces over there to help protect it, and it will be helpful, but it's not going to help you to flip. The other thing that you should notice too is that low threshold for this Sardaukar is 0 to 2. It's not 0 to 1. So you are at 2 here, and you dipped down to 1. You had to flip to low threshold. You got back up to 2. It doesn't flip to high threshold till you get to 3. So it's a little bit harder for the Emperor to get back to high threshold on Salusa. And it has to be Sardaukar. It can't just be regular forces. That won't have no effect on there. So their bonus, when they're at low threshold, is just 2. So they're at 3 at high, 2 at low. It's the opposite. They're at 2 at high and 3 at low. Does this make the Emperor way too complicated to play? Well, it's a little more complicated, but I think it's thematic and interesting, and it gives, the Emperor is one of the easiest factions to play because in advance, they just have 2 things that they're really paying attention to. I get paid, which you don't really have to worry about too much. That's not hard. And I've got Sardaukar, which I can increase their strength unless I'm fighting the Fremen. So, yeah, I think if you're saying, yeah, we're going to fold Homeworlds into the game, even if you have somebody who's like, well, they're not as experienced, so we're giving them the Emperor. You are playing with Homeworlds in general, so there is more that you have to pay attention to. But again, it's all right here on the card, so it shouldn't be too hard to manage. So let me know your thoughts on the Emperor. For me, I love the fact that there are 2 planets. It's thematic and it's interesting. I love the artwork. This is kind of a little Easter egg for the Lynch movie. And then you can see, if you know the history of Salusa Secundus, the decor on this planet will make a lot of sense. Yeah, if you've had a chance to play with these Emperor Homeworlds, let me know what you thought of that. And any other questions that you have, hit me up in the comments. That's it for this one. Thanks, everybody, for watching, and we'll see you again soon.